I was shocked at the degree to which the Republican Party was actually made up of that crazy uncle you have around Thanksgiving that just sort of spouts nonsense, and you assume, okay, he's all over there by himself. And let's face it, when we men get old, we get really stubborn and we don't tend to change. I think the true heart of conservatism simultaneously is populism rightly understood. In other words, it does in fact value the people, but it's also attaining higher ideas. One of the great lies of progressivism is that it's the elites and the experts that can fix everything. The great lie of populism is that governing is easy. That the reason we have problems is because the people in charge are lazy or stupid or corrupt. And if we got rid of them, and if we put, Joe Smith, the guy down the street, in the White House, he'd just fix all the problems. It's not perfect. It's just you don't improve upon all men are created equal. I think what worries me at night is the degree to which we're living on borrowed time economically. The degree to which we are over-indebted in almost all Western countries, possibly all, and our inability to reckon with that and to truly live within our means. I think it is fundamentally an evil thing to deliberately not consider the good of the future generations and to behave in such a way that it necessarily is going to deplete their life savings, things that they have. I think that's a blight on our heart.
Concepts with Sean Watley.
Today we have a fascinating guest. His name is Josh Lewis. I ran into Josh through his podcast, Saving Elephants. He has an inside view of politics, but he also has an inside view of government, as well as having an interest and a deep understanding of traditional conservative thought. So we had a fascinating discussion about where things are at right now in America. What are his thoughts on Trump, on whether or not he is a conservative and what kind of conservative he might be. We delved into a few of the more difficult issues that we've been trying to tackle in this show here before. The difficulty between universalism and particularism. Is truth true everywhere at all times in all places, or is there a role for understanding particular things? Ultimately, Josh is at his most insightful when he's trying to sort out for the rest of us these deeper tensions between politics and real life and philosophy and how we can live and institutions and character. So I hope you enjoy this as much as I did. Thanks again for stopping by. Please let me know what you think. And I always forget to say this, don't forget to like and subscribe. Josh, welcome.
It's good to see you again, Sean.
Yeah, you also. I was just reflecting in the pre-show about your blog, or your podcast rather, Saving Elephants. And I have listened to that actually on and off for the last number of years. You've had it going for about 7 years now. And so I want to hear why you went through all the time and effort and perseverance to do this for 7 years for what sounds like a focus on a millennial audience. So why millennials? Why do they need saving? What are you saving them from? So I wonder if you could just unpack that for us.
Oh, it's a great question. And it's been a joy. Don't get me wrong. I have loved this process. But yeah, I've obviously exerted some effort over these 7 years, as one wouldn't ordinarily do unless they had a passion or reason. I thought I was going to go crazy in our political climate, and I didn't know where I fit in. I am and have always been a traditional conservative, and it seemed like everyone else was changing the definition of what that meant right out from under me. Now, I'm being a little glib. Obviously, some people, I think I discovered, wait a minute, maybe what they had always meant was different, and I just misunderstood. And then in other cases, I think I hopefully have developed a little bit deeper my own understanding of what those things mean. Beginning with, but not exactly, I don't want to tie it all to Donald Trump, but the 2016 moment where he comes down the golden escalators, if you will, I think it sort of revealed what had been there all along, maybe boiling under the surface that I didn't quite understand. That traditional conservatism, as I understood it, of a limited government, I'll just say, put it in a messy sense, a sort of Ronald Reagan type approach to national politics, was not equally shared or argued as I thought it was among the right. I knew it wasn't the only view among the right, but I had no idea. And there are some, let's call them good-faithed and well-reasoned individuals who support the president. But I was shocked at the degree to which the Republican Party was actually made up of that crazy uncle you have around Thanksgiving that just sort of spouts nonsense, and you assume, okay, he's all over there by himself. It's like, oh, wait, that's a pretty sizable minority. And it just occurred to me, Sean, talking to maybe a predominantly Canadian audience, throwing a Thanksgiving reference in there may be more confusing than helpful. But anyhow, that member of your family you have that's a little off, and you present, they're fun. It's all fun and games, but then all of a sudden they're the ones running the country. Now it's a little scary.
Yeah.
So you mentioned millennials, long-winded answer of saying I'm a millennial. That's a generation I grew up in. I think all generations, in a sense, need saving. I think that's the great conservative project, right? We were born into this world, and nature's against us, and we do everything in our power to try to help those coming up after us and ourselves and the older generation to try to make it through this dark, dismal life. Try to cling to what we can, what embers of humanity and civilization we can. But as a millennial, I felt like my generation in particular was missing in a lot of ways. I think most of what we understood conservatism to be was the George W. Bush years. And while that, it's a mixed bag there, I'm not all anti-Bush. I think the problem was it necessarily meant when you have someone like a Donald Trump, that appears to be the only alternative. And so it becomes a sort of, well, if you're not for Trump, what are you for those elite neocons that got us into the housing mess and the war in Iraq and all this? And again, it's a complex argument, but I guess I myself was so impressed with the depth and clarity of conservative intellectual tradition that I really wanted to share that with my generation. It's not for everybody, but I know for some people out there, I truly believe there are many people out there that are like me that when they begin to learn of this stuff say, why are we not talking about this more? This is animating and it's enriching, and it encourages you in a sphere, a political sphere that is very discouraging at the moment. And so that's in a nutshell, I guess, what Saving Elephants is all about, is me trying to ignite that same passion in my fellow millennials who may just have never been introduced to a healthier view of politics.
Yeah. Now, has your audience been limited to millennials, or have you found that actually your audience has expanded way beyond that?
It's hard to know in a podcast space exactly who your audience is. It's probably fair to say it's largely millennials, but no, it's certainly expanded beyond that. I've had many individuals listen for various reasons. I've had a good many friends on the left, or maybe some of them I wouldn't call friends, but just loose acquaintances, if you will, who find the podcast interesting because they say, Josh, I disagree with almost everything you say, but you don't sound nuts. And so I like to hear your thinking. And that's older and younger Americans, of course. The thing is, when I started 7 years ago, when you said millennials, what you really meant was young Americans.
Right,
but
right.
Heck, I'm in my 40s,
You're old.
I'm old, and I want to welcome in the Gen Z and eventually the Alpha generation also. I just don't know that I'm not in as much of their headspace as I am with my fellow millennials, and so that's another reason I've tried to stay within that narrow focus.
Yeah. So you mentioned Trump, and we can't talk to an American without talking about Trump. So Trump is not a millennial. So is he beyond saving, or can you save Trump, or what are your thoughts on Trump?
Can I save Trump? Probably not. I don't want to think that anyone is beyond saving, but I think what I find particularly discouraging is the issue is not whether or not Trump is redeemable. It's that he has created an ecosystem, and a lot of willing participants are in an ecosystem that have deliberately withheld any sort of reform from the president. And I think this in a religious sense almost more than a political sense. I mean, the degree to which the broader evangelical, predominantly white evangelical Republican movement here in the United States has endorsed and sanctified, if you will, every move the man makes. And will often say things like, look, I don't appreciate his tweets, or say, I won't want my kids to talk like that. But we'll look to him as such a figurehead of a defender of Christianity that I think it is very disheartening, because it's almost as if Trump, while he might be a particularly stubborn person, and let's face it, when we men get old, we get really stubborn and we don't tend to change. And I don't think anybody is beyond redemption, but he is not surrounded by believers, or, and that's a religious sense, or even within the conservative movement, those who hold a conservative tradition, that really want to speak truth to him, that really want to challenge him in ways that may, encourage him to grow. And granted, some of that's his fault. He's made it very clear he does not want those dissenting voices around. But so too, a lot of individuals have, for whatever reason, just thought it would be, and I think they're doing this in good faith most of the time. Somehow it would be in the better interest of the country or in my faith or the party if I sort of played along and told him he was right in all these ways. So I hope that's an answer to your question. But I'm less concerned, can we redeem Trump, than I am the people around him who don't seem interested in redeeming Trump.
Yeah, no, that was a great reflection. You're making me think, and I apologize if you don't have any thoughts on this, but I'll just throw it out there. So you mentioned that you've come at conservative thought sort of from a traditional spot, traditional conservatism, philosophical conservatism, perhaps we might say. And you mentioned Trump and then evangelicals. So certainly that's my background as well. And I think the evangelical mindset is more fitting or overlaps better with liberalism in the sense of focus on the individual, focus on egalitarianism. We're all equal in the eyes of the law, all equal in the eyes of God. Universalism, what's true is true everywhere, all the time, in all places. And then meliorism, we're going to work really hard and make everything better, as opposed to a Burkean traditionalism. Edmund Burke, the famous British statesman, and some people don't like calling him a philosopher. I think he is a fairly philosophical guy, which has a much greater deference to established institutions, much greater deference to all the stuff that has come before. So it seems to be a greater humility just from the starting point of saying, I'm not sure we can get this right, versus the American, but also Canadian, evangelical, independent, rugged individualism. That's the term I was looking for. So have you ever turned your mind to that, and how conservatism, at least as I think you and I are probably approaching it, more the philosophical / traditional kind of flavor, is that really the same kind of conservatism as a Trump, or even as an evangelical flavored hyper-individualism, universalism, egalitarianism? And I apologize if this isn't something, you can pass on this question, but have you thought about that?
Well, I think you know this about me, Sean. There are very few things I don't have thoughts on. Whether or not they're lucid and good thoughts, I can't say, but I have thought about that. I'm loath to try to simplify them in such a degree that I would say that there is no room for, I'll say, intellectual conservatism within a broader evangelical understanding. But it has not escaped my attention as an evangelical myself, and maybe I didn't make that clear earlier, but I deeply critique the evangelical movement as one who identifies by the original definition, maybe not as a cultural, but as a religious definition. Speaking of that as myself, I know that it's kind of an odd fit for the intellectual conservative. To be frank, if you're reading the forefathers, you're mostly reading Jews and Catholics. Burke was an Anglican, right? It was high church. Now, there's some crossover between the two, and on occasion, you've got your, I'll say, Christian-friendly Roger Scrutins, who were not themselves, Hayek was. I don't think he was a theist. I could be doing him an injustice there, but he certainly was not a Christian. And then there are others that they're escaping my. There are a lot of individuals who recognize the necessary role of Christianity within a traditional conservative framework, while they themselves were not Christian or were not evangelical. A lot of the Catholics and the Jews would say as much. Irving Kristol would talk about, look, it is incumbent upon Protestant Christianity to be vibrant and healthy, because that's the majority in the Western world. And so I think it's sort of an odd fit, because you're right. Broadly speaking, the rugged individualism of the evangelical does fit more naturally with the classical liberalism, which is a sort of, I'll say, more vulgar form of conservatism. You've got a conservative and a progressive expression of classical liberalism. So I'm not trying to write everybody out of the movement. But you don't tend to have those individuals reading Burke late in the evening, which is fine. I don't think most of us need to do that. But it is an odd fit, admittedly. And so it's something that, and this has been an argument, by the way, that conservatives have had for a long time. How do we How do we take these very lofty ideas and translate them in a manner that's salient to the general public? Because I think the true heart of conservatism simultaneously is populism rightly understood. In other words, it does in fact value the people, but it's also attaining higher ideas, and it is necessarily seeking always to find ways to communicate those higher truths to the masses, not as a sort of the elite ruling the masses, but as this idea that we are all humans endued with dignity from God, and that we all have an equal right and duty to adhere to these higher ideas, even if we can't comprehend them, even if we don't have the desire to. That what is needful in a state is statesmen who understand this, recognize it, and humbly see themselves as leaders of the people, not above them, but those who are plugged into this, say, grander tradition. I may have gotten way off from the original question,
Oh, no.
but hopefully that sort of strikes at an answer there.
No, that was brilliant. And one of the things I scribbled down is the dissenting, I guess, denominations or sects in Britain and the Puritans. And it seems like that flavor of thinking has a stronger influence, force, representation in America. And so it becomes even more acute on the American side to rectify or sort out this liberalism versus a traditional approach to conservatism. One of the writers that came to mind when you're answering to was, I think, of David Hume. Many people would look to him and say, "Oh, he's a theist at best or a deist,"
Right.
but he really trashed miracles, etc. But he says, no, we need the church because we need habit and tradition, and if we don't have that, we don't have a society. So, pretty wet on religion overall. But he said, yeah, we need that. And so that leads to my question, and you've already alluded to this. How do you frame this tension between conservatism, and perhaps we'll call it traditional conservatism, and the notion that American conservatism, North American conservatism, because you hear this in Canada as well, is nothing but classical liberalism? So have you turned your mind to that at all?
Yeah, I've not solved that puzzle, but I've certainly turned my mind to it. You and I've had the same conversation, of course, and I think it is a necessarily enduring conversation, one that I don't know that any human is capable of ever solving for all times. I don't mean that we can't make much progress and that much good can't come out of trying to differentiate the two. The first person that comes to mind when you ask a question like that is Russell Kirk, because of course he made a name for himself with his The Conservative Mind, a very thick, intimidating book, excellent book. I would highly recommend it if somebody truly wants to understand the conservative tradition. And in effect, what he's doing there, and it was originally his dissertation that he turns into a book, that strangely enough becomes a very popular book. I was saying earlier, we don't expect people to be reading Burke late at night, but he hit a moment in time when I think people were hungry for this. We were so washed in liberalism, and here was this alternative view. And what Kirk was trying to argue was that it was not just liberalism, but that there was simultaneously a very strong, clear strand of traditional conservatism, classical conservatism, and he follows it up with his boot.
You're Canadian now,
I guess
man.
my Canadian's coming out.
That's right.
with another book, Roots of American Order, I believe it is. I'm blanking on that.
Yeah, it is.
I believe that's the title.
Yeah.
I'm momentarily blanking, but that he essentially traces, the traditions from ancient Greece and Rome, Athens, Rome, Jerusalem, the religious monotheism, London, and kind of the British traditions we get, and then finally Philadelphia with the Constitutional Convention. And that this combination, this great river, if you will, of Western tradition funnels from ancient times all the way up until his own time and to our time today, that has a continuous conservative strand of ideas and traditions we hold on to. And yeah, they move and they meld and they evolve, but there's still a through line.
Yeah.
He does that in the Roots of American Order, but in The Conservative Mind, he basically starts with Burke and then John Adams, who were, they weren't chummy, but they were contemporaries, if you will, and says, look, from the beginning, the United States has this conservative origin. You don't have to rely on the Thomas Jefferson liberal approach of all men are created equal, that is some sort of a Jacobin, French Revolutionary. We all have rights, and therefore let's just assert those rights. And I would say I'm about 60% on board with his argument. I think he's right, but I think to just simply say that there's a strong conservative tradition that simultaneously exists along liberalism is maybe putting, and not that he said that exactly, but that to just think of these two things as equals maybe putting a little too starkly. I think it is certainly true in the United States history that there have been moments and eras in which conservatism appears pretty dang dormant. And oftentimes any intellectual tradition you might want to draw on to try to understand, well, what are we doing as Americans? What does this even mean? And to a certain degree, you in Canada there too, would have to rely upon your liberal intellects, right, or your liberal documents, your original first principles. I don't think conservatism ever truly died, but it's not as if it's been as vibrant a force or as easy to tangle with as sort of liberalism. And part of that's the problem with conservatism, that it's not as didactic, it's not as, or at least Burkean conservatism, it's not as systematic, if you will, right? You can't just write these things. In fact, Kirk, one of his most famous essays is the 10 Conservative Principles. And in the conservative mind, he's only got 6 of them. And you can kind of see, I think these are sort of the same ones. So did he add them later? Well, I was speaking with Jeffrey Nelson, Russell Kirk's son-in-law. And if Kirk has passed on, but his son-in-law said, yeah, Kirk would routinely mix up the order of the 10. And he did that on purpose. And sometimes it'd be 7, sometimes it would be more than 2. He did it on purpose because he did not want people thinking conservatism is something that you could reduce to 10 bullet points and understand it.
Beautiful.
That makes it kind of hard to get a hold of, right? It makes liberalism something. I don't mean liberalism simple necessarily, but it's digestible in theory.
Yeah.
And so again, long-winded way of answering your question, that I think they are two distinct traditions. I think it's murky and almost impossible to untangle. But I think that's sort of the role of the conservative, is to understand that yes, this did exist alongside liberalism, and it's and they're a symbiotic relationship, right? Because they're mutually reinforcing at times. They're antagonistic to each other at times. You can't really have one without the other in any ultimate sense, I don't think. But I think it is also important too to recognize, as I do, I am a conservative. That is different than just a classical liberal, even though I might find a lot of points that I agree with them on. I am a distinct thing from that.
Yeah, beautiful answer. Beautiful. So I can't leave Kirk without asking you this question. It seems that I see more people dismissing Kirk than, and now I'm suspicious of this, and maybe this isn't true. I suspect they haven't read much Kirk. So I think it was partway through, I'd read his Conservative Mind, and then I was into Prospects for Conservatives, which is kind of his thinner book, and maybe I was into his anthology. And that was the first time I heard someone say, oh, Kirk, yeah, he's that nut bar that said cars were mechanical Jacobins. And, oh, did you know that Kirk also wrote about, a dozen ghost stories, and he thought his house was haunted? And so it seems like that is used as fodder to dismiss what I think is a very thorough and thoughtful writer, and, what did he call himself? He's an academic without a position or outside of academia. So how do you defend Kirk when people, at least my impression is, people are trying to dismiss him as, oh yeah, he's that crazy guy who talked about mechanical Jacobins?
It may be fair to say he was, most conservative intellectuals, one of the fun things about it, as you learn, is they're all kind of nuts. They're just characters. They're weird. And Kirk, I would not put up there as the upper echelon of some of the craziest, but he did have his eccentricities, if you will. He was definitely one far more into horror stories and hauntings and things of that nature than most conservatives. I do wonder, when you say that, it makes me wonder, because Kirk is to a certain degree kind of being resurrected among the, say, nationalist populist crowd. Mm-hmm. He was a support, and this is something I think he did that was ill-advised. He was a big supporter of Patrick Buchanan. There we go.
Yeah.
Even up late into life, recognized that paleo-conservative trend, which I think there are healthier versions of paleo-conservatism, and I think Kirk is, in a sense, sort of the father of that. But it has morphed into a Trumpian, a very ugly thing that I think is the antithesis of what it means to be an American. Maybe Kirk would disagree with me in saying that if he were alive today. I don't know. But I do wonder sometimes if some conservatives distance themselves from Kirk because they see in him the roots of these more latent movements. And it is true that he was kind of an odd duck. He was kind of given to spiritualities in a way that makes us a little uncomfortable. And I think that's part of the beauty of Kirk is that he deliberately stood against, I don't want to say modernity per se, but the industrialization, the centralization, that he saw things being lost in humanity in this progress. He would deliberately wear these sort of, out of centuries out of fashion hats or coats and stuff. Albert J. Knox was kind of famous for doing that too. But with Kirk, I think it wasn't a fashion statement. He was literally trying to stand against his time, if you will, saying we've lost some things in the past. I personally think he went a little too far there, but I don't think that's a reason to not read Kirk. I don't think that's a reason to not see him in immense value that helps explain what conservatism is. I think there are, we can nitpick lots. I don't want to say nitpick, that's a bad way of putting it. There are some ways in which Kirk read from a modern lens is a little startling, in that I think he had a little bit of a blind eye to the excesses of racism in the United States and what that might lead to. And he has, unfortunate, way too much a defense of Calhoun in the conservative mind, even though in all fairness, he essentially acknowledges that, I'm not touching the slavery stuff. He just doesn't go far enough, I think, in kind of distancing himself from that. Let me be super clear here. There is no record, to the best of my knowledge, at all that Kirk had even the remotest racist bone in his body. Quite the opposite. I think it was just, at times he didn't, one might not appreciate the degree to which things could be misunderstood from a more modern lens, that when you elevate certain individuals, it's not just specifics of their ideas you're elevating, it's also some of the racist baggage. And so I think there are reasons people distance themselves from Kirk, but I think it's to their shame, because I think there's a lot we can learn from him. He was, in a lot of ways, the guy that got the entire intellectual tradition started in the modern era. And to not read him, I think you do yourself a disservice.
Yeah. And then the thought occurred when you were saying all that too. I believe he was well known for opening his home to strangers and people coming through and students. And so he really tried to live out this spirit of a gentleman, I guess, if you want, spirit of religion, spirit of a gentleman. I think those are Burkean phrases, but really tried to be generous and open and welcoming and magnanimous. And we miss all of that if we just say, oh yeah, he wrote ghost stories and wore weird clothes now and then. The other thought that occurred to me when you were talking too is that I don't think, and you can correct me if I'm wrong on this, but I don't think he tried to be original. He seemed to always be pointing to someone else, to the roots, or, these are all the names that you need to know if you want to think conservatively. And he wasn't trying to be innovative and come up with a new ideology. He went out of his way to do the opposite. Now, is that your sense of him as well?
No, I think that's fair. I think that Kirk, as much as I love Kirk, the main reason I think he's important is because he points us to Burke, and he has a sort of Americanized version of Burke that helps explain, okay, here's how this guy could fit in a conservative tradition that even works in the United States. And I think Burke was so careful about innovations and ideological certainty that Kirk picks up on some of that. I don't mean it wasn't something that he saw himself. I guess I just meant, I think, in trying to channel that kind of, Kirk himself says, look, conservatism begins with sentiments, right? It's a mode, it's an expression, it's a way of life. It is not an ideology. It is. I don't think he coined this term, but he did call conservatism the negation of ideology. Again, I'm 60% in agreement. I think he went a little too strong there. Yeah. That's a whole other can of worms, or we could go down that road later if we want to. But I do believe you are correct. He very deliberately was, cautious about expressing things as if they're innovative ideas. It was far more about, as he said once, when it comes to the circumference of the earth, I would much rather trust the experts. And it wasn't that he thought individuals were incapable of genius and innovation. It was that I think he saw his roles as far more important to remind, that's what conservatism is in a sense, right? Reminding us of things. Because it turns out no matter how much a genius I might be, I will never compare to the vast history that's come before us.
Yeah. Well said. Well said. So segueing then from there to the modern Republican Party, and you've
That's a
mentioned.
big leap.
Hey, you're not supposed to laugh at my question, sir. No, that was legitimate. I wasn't thinking of that as being humorous, but in hindsight, yes, that is pretty crazy. But so we're talking about types of conservatism. We mentioned Trump a bit earlier. We're trying to say, well, what is this thing that is conservatism in the States? And most people think Republican Party conservatism. That is the voice of conservatism in
Right.
America. And yet you've mentioned a few times now that this Trump guy, I have some problems with the not just his behavior but some of the ideas he has. And to be clear, some of the things Trump has done, I've actually been very impressed with. Wow, that's really good. This term, I don't think many people in Canada are too happy with him just from the tariffs. It's just like, oh man, I was sure stupid to say anything good about Trump. So now we all hate him, and hopefully things will improve, before he ends his term, and he'll get carved into Mount Rushmore or something as a great president. I think that's probably what he wants. Or maybe, anyways, we better stop going down that path. What is your sense of the thought behind the modern Republican Party? And from north of the border, we hear people, and I won't name the outfit or the writer because I don't want to impugn their thought based on my misunderstanding of what they're saying. But it seems like there's more willingness to influence markets, control markets, shape markets, close borders. Everybody says, oh, that's definitely not a conservative thing. And we could debate whether or not that is a conservative thing. But what is your sense of the Republican Party itself and where its mind is at right now?
Yeah, that's a big question. And it's such a big question that I struggle with how to even begin at something striking at an answer. Well, first of all, let me go here because the name of my show is Saving Elephants. I don't bear anyone any ill will if they make a lot of the same, come to a lot of the same conclusions I do, and then at the end of it say, okay, therefore I cannot call myself a Republican. There's nothing similar between the Republican Party today and this broader conservative tradition you're talking about. The problem here is that in the United States, we have a two-party system and most likely always will. Now, you can get rid of one of the two parties, but that doesn't mean you get three parties. It means you just swapped one of them out for another. The Republicans replaced the Whig Party in a sense. We've been stuck with Democrats and Republicans for a long time. And I think in all likelihood, the Republican Party is closer to being adequately or accurately described as the conservative or at least the right-leaning party in the United States. When you compare it to the Democrats, right? It's a lot of these things now, if you have some certain one-off issues like January 6th, election denial, there are certain things which you could say, okay, there may be some instances in which the Democrats actually do offer more for traditional conservatism. But that's fairly few and far between. It is true also that even within the Republican Party in the modern sense, it does have a lot of conservative impulses. Even if it has a much more Jacksonian, populist, sort of simple-minded way of expressing them. And that's not always bad. One of the great lies of progressivism is that it's the elites and the experts that can fix everything. Sometimes the alternative is a more limited government that just allows individuals to work through these problems in their life, take responsibility. But there are a lot of ways in which it's difficult to say. When we're talking about policy, it's harder to say, well, what is a conservative policy? Are closed borders a conservative policy or open borders a conservative policy? I think it depends on the context. I really do. I can't definitively say for all time and all people it's one or the other. What should the tax rate be? What kind of taxes should we have? Now, maybe there are some things from, say, the standpoint of like an American conservative that I would argue strongly have to be all-time enduring conservative positions. And I might be losing my Burkean credentials in even saying that, but I think the safest thing I can go to is the Abraham Lincoln liberty and equality, that these two things are held in tension. Representative government is good, but so too is liberty, and so too is equality. And what happens when these things don't align? It gets messy. How do you maintain the sovereignty of a state while not allowing that state to enslave some of its people? And I think those are things that, and maybe this is getting more closer to Burke, every once in a while in politics, we come across a fundamental principle or value that you can't just compromise or work around. Now, I stress every once in a while because the lie of today's politics is every freaking thing we argue about, we act as if it's the end of the world if we lose the argument. Those things are rare. The Civil War and the the view of slavery as an example of one of those things. And so I want to allow for a great deal of malleability, if you will, with the Republican Party and the right are always going to have some symbiotic relationship with conservatism, but it's messy. The Republican Party also gave us Richard Nixon. Was he a conservative? I mean, compared to some, sure, but compared to Reagan, he was a liberal, right? It's, the Democratic Party gave us JFK, who was a liberal, but, he lowered taxes, and so you can go down a long list. I think the conservative movement is a component of the broader right that is always there trying to encourage the party of the right to understand why this is the better way to go. And some years we're in power and some years we're not. Most of the time we're not. But that's not an excuse for just saying, well, therefore we're going to try the Democrats, or we're just going to, hang it all, give up. It doesn't make any sense to fight further.
Yeah, beautiful answer. It was wonderful to watch you wrestling with sort of a Burkean prudential approach and saying, well, sometimes and sometimes this and sometimes. So that was brilliant. And then at the same time, though, you said, but there are some universal principles. And so it's a nice link. I wanted to ask one of the other big thinkers in American political thought, and I think he was perhaps the brainchild behind a lot of the thinking in the neoconservative movement, was Leo Strauss. And you've had Straussians on your show. And this is something that I haven't resolved. And so I'm asking you to fix this for me, right? This is a problem that I have that you, Josh, now must fix.
Oh, dear.
And you raised it. You raised it in your last response. You said, well, sometimes we have to do this, but also we have these universals. And so this is something that I've been talking with a lot of people about, this tension between universals and particulars. And when you talk to or listen to the paleocons, they're really hyper-focused on the particulars and the particularities of the American experience, the American founding, the Anglo-American tradition, the tradition in the West. They insist that this is based on the particularities of a certain historical time and place. Leo Strauss, at least my understanding of him, would say that is terrible. That's an example of historicism, and that means you're a total relativist and you'll just fall for anything. You have no morals, and we need to look back to the Greek philosophers to find out what is true and good, and whatever is true and good everywhere. But that makes me nervous that people like our Prime Minister Mark Carney, will write a book titled Values and then enforce his understanding of values on the rest of us. So it's a very long way of saying it. You started tackling this prudentialism versus actually standing for something.
Yeah.
How do you sort that out vis-a-vis neocons and Strauss?
Oh, that's a great question. And you're right. I do have some Straussians on the program, mostly the Straussians and Burkeans have frenemy type relationships. So I love my Straussian brethren. I just think they're wrong about some points. The original argument between the Straussians and the Burkeans goes back to arguably Leo Strauss's most famous book, Natural Rights and History. His closing chapter is about Edmund Burke, and Strauss is in his own right a brilliant thinker. Who, you're right, I sometimes wonder how fair it is to credit him with all the numerous offshoots of the right that he birthed, because he wasn't around for most of this. To what degree he's responsible for neoconservatism, I don't know, but there's some intertangling there. We could talk about that in a moment, I suppose. But in Natural Rights and History, and you use this word historicism, which I think is a good one. Today we tend to call it more relativism, this sort of notion that truths are necessarily beholden to the moment we're born into, the particulars, the context we're born into, right? There is no actual relative view, there is no actual right or wrong beyond just the context of what works in the moment or with the society and the history. And this opens up the door to all sorts of nonsense that Strauss is very concerned about. And he's very concerned with Rousseau, rightly so. And he's very concerned, maybe I should say he's concerned but less so with Edmund Burke. And in his book, he sort of points to Burke because Burke at the time is writing about the French Revolution. And the French Revolution is establishing these universal principles, right, that sound really good on paper. Liberty, fraternity, equality. It just turns out it ends up in the guillotine and and mass execution and the deposition of the state and all sorts of nonsense. If you establish something as a universal that you don't actually know how to do. I think Burke, therefore, is necessarily critiquing this sort of notion that we can just, through some sort of universal fiat, say this is what's right, therefore that's what government's going to be like. I think one of the ways in which Strauss gets Burke wrong, possibly, is that is an understandable view of Burke if all you ever read is his reflections on the Revolution in France. But if you read more of Burke, in fact, even in the Revolution in France, Burke literally says, see if I can word this just right, that he doesn't disavow all principles, otherwise he'd be disavowing prudence itself. Like there has to be something deeper in the background. I think what Burke is very cautious about is, okay, yeah, universal truths exist. What does that mean for us in politics? Like, it's the application of universal truths I'm interested in, and that's where sort of the argument starts to fall apart. Just because universal truth exists does not imply that I'm capable of pulling it down from the heavens and saying, therefore I know what the tax rate should be, therefore I know who should or shouldn't be in prison, or I know what political party should be in power, or I know what perfect equality actually means. In all fairness, I don't think Strauss would have argued that. But I think that is one of those tensions. I think that's the place where the Burkean response, in my view, transcends Straussianism. Strauss was right to look to the Greeks, that they have a sort of universalism that builds up to today through Western civilization, although Strauss himself also suggested that there's a simultaneous, I think he called it the Bible simply, the religious tradition of Judaism and Christianity, that was simultaneously equally important and ultimately irreconcilable from Greek philosophy. I don't know if that's true or not. He deeply believed these things cannot be reconciled, nor can you ever say one is unimportant and the other is all important. And he thought the vitality of the West was that tension between these two and this constant tension, attempt to try to reconcile them, which he thought would be ultimately impossible. And so before I get too far off, maybe I'm too far off in the weeds already.
No, you're
before
doing
I get
great.
too much further, I think that's sort of where I land, is that Burke, I think the value he shows us is, yes, universal truths exist. But be cautious what that means with a political application, because as humans, we are very limited. It means we simultaneously need to recognize universal truths as something that, our life has meaning beyond the state, beyond politics. It also means that you can't ever completely say our politics aren't hinting at universal truths. Of course they are. They have to be. Every law we pass has to hint somehow at some moral compass or code. Even if the moral compass or code is broken and ugly. We're trying to communicate some value through our rules and regulations and traditions. But we can't attain it perfectly. And so for Burke, where this goes is, okay, but what you can do is slowly through time, through tradition, you can kind of feel your way out, if you will. You can see this is what worked. We don't fully understand why, but we're going to defer to tradition. We're going to respect tradition. Here's where the Strausses start to get nervous, right? That sounds like historicism. We're not talking about universal truths. Now we're just talking about something just because somebody said it a long time ago, it's okay. But I think Burke recognized universal truths have to be housed in traditions because we're human and we're fallible and we're incapable of actually actualizing a universal truth.
Yeah, well said. As you were talking, the thought came to mind that it almost seems like Strauss and Burke are coming at two ends of the theory versus practice debate, right? Burke had a ton of practical experience in politics, and I think the word you used was messy, or maybe you didn't, but that was what I thought you said, and that's how I interpreted that life, especially practical politics, often requires coalition building and compromises, and so Burke is very much on that side, whereas Leo Strauss was an academic. He lived in and thought and wrote in a world. I'm not saying he was completely divested of reality, but he wasn't as intimately. He wasn't a practical politician, and so
Right.
he was very much
Right.
on the side of theory. And the other thought that occurred to me, though, listening to you, this is a common theme in conservative circles, especially now, right? Be a anti-elite, right? We're populists, and especially in the North American, from Thunder Bay west in Canada, and in the certainly in the center of United States, rugged individualism is just about me. I don't need someone else telling me what to think or what to do, and yet here you and I are talking about all these pillars of conservatism, both historically and on the American side. And so are we anti-elites, or maybe we are pro-elites? And if so, who are the elites today, and how do we identify them? And do our modern elites have any kind of sense of the need to give back to society? So have you turned your mind to this whole issue of elites, especially today when we see the tech bros on the stage with Trump and really, I would say, a basic level of disinterest in reading people like Strauss and Burke or anyone else that we've mentioned?
I think elites are inevitable. And I would even go so far as to say most, I'll call them intelligent populists, would agree with that argument also. I recall Tucker Carlson, who I don't have a great deal of respect for, but he is an intelligent person. He rails against the elites consistently, but he himself even says, look, I'm not saying just get rid of elites. That would be insane. I'm saying get better elites than the ones we have. And ironically, I'm kind of saying the same thing, but I'm saying it in a, I'll say, non-populist way, which is the great lie of populism, is that governing is easy. That the reason we have problems is because the people in charge are lazy or stupid or corrupt. And if we got rid of them, and if we put, Joe Smith, the guy down the street, in the White House, he'd just fix all the problems. There is an element of truth to this, because certainly there is corruption in the higher upper echelons, and power does tend to corrupt. But I think the populist response is one that is ultimately hollow and usually just creates a new class of elite. I think at bottom, you can't have a functional liberal society, lowercase l liberal society, if there isn't thick institutions and a deep commitment to some sort of moral compass, be it religious or even philosophical, that runs throughout the entire society. And obviously not everyone has to have that, but you have to have a pretty solid core that does. I think that is important for the farmer as it is for the president and everybody in between. And I think that you don't, I don't think you, Russell Kirk said this one time, something to the effect of, well, where are these elites going to come from? If we're in a culture that doesn't value virtue, where does the elite come from? Yes, we can find smart people. They're not going to be virtuous. Like, you have a virtuous culture, it produces virtuous elites. Now, it's more than just that, right? Because you can have a lot of virtue and still be a blithering idiot. And not do your job well. But I think that's part of the issue here is that we have this misguided notion that the problems of the world go away if we get rid of the guys at the top and put me in place, rather than a recognition that maybe we have a broken culture that is not conducive to virtue, that is not actually calling us to our better angels. And that if we had that, then we might be able to take a hard look of, okay, how do we actually stack our elite institutions, if you will, with individuals who genuinely have the best interest of the country as a whole in mind. I would also say, too, as sort of an aside, that I think one of the oddities of the modern world is that, in a general sense, the conservatives are supposed to be the establishment in charge, and the progressives are supposed to be, the hippies outside beating down the doors trying to get in. And we have this topsy-turvy world, not even on politics, but certainly within culture, within entertainment, within business and Hollywood, where the left is in charge. And it's weird because nobody knows what to do about it. The left doesn't know how to stop talking as if it's the minority, and the right doesn't know how to start talking as if it has any clue how to, essentially run institutions. And that's not an unsolvable problem. It's just kind of a peculiarity of the moment we live in that I think adds a little, complexity to this problem, if you will.
Yeah. It's interesting to hear you make a shout out to institutions. And I agree. I tend to agree with you on that. And it helps me make more sense of Buckley's famous comment. Didn't he say, I'd rather be governed by the first 1,000 names, was it? Of the
100
Boston,
names and yeah.
How does it go? First 100 names of the Boston phone
Boston
book?
telephone directory, then the faculty of Harvard.
Yes, right.
Or
right.
Harvard, Princeton, Yale, or something to that effect. Yeah.
Yeah, so that seems to resonate with this populist anti-elite vibe. However, it's easy to say that if you have the institutional structure and guardrails to be able to interchange individuals as long as they're, good Americans, shall we say. But I'm not sure we have the institution or even, what is a good American today versus in Buckley's time. So I wonder if he would say the same thing today.
Well, and I also dare say, even if Buckley would say the same thing today, that phrase is often repeated by individuals who, if they read or saw anything else of Buckley, he wasn't exactly Bubba in a shrimp boat, right? I mean, he was the very epitome of this. He has this accent that just sounds not so much egotistical, but it sounds elite. I don't know how else to describe that. And the way he talks, his diction is almost always above the average person's head. And he mingled with the elites of the left and right in society. I mean, he was friends to presidents. He was, he's frequently having debates with the liberal intellectual elites of the day. I don't discount his quote. I think he meant it very sincerely. And I think he had a sort of, the left of this country, which has seized institutional powers, are crazy. And if we just put this in the hands of the average Joe, would be better off. But I do think very strongly Buckley's entire career was not one of just trying to say, the average yokels could solve all of our problems if we put them in power. And I bring that up because there are a lot of people on the right today that use that exact quote and use Buckley as a symbol for this. And I don't think he would, I just don't think he's the right symbol for that movement.
Yeah, it seems to misrepresent him. I thought he was weird too. He said a lot of really good things. Brilliant guy, well read, but you watch him on the firing line and he's kind of falling off to the side of the camera. Anyway,
his mannerisms are fascinating.
Yeah, there was something going on there. But I won't try to diagnose him without having known the guy. And I'll just diagnose him as being brilliant. We'll leave it at that.
Yeah.
But we can't leave the concept of elite and versus populace without addressing at least a short comment on the Constitution. So it seems to me like on the right in America, the Constitution is a North Star. It's a really important touch point for a touchstone for the American right. And yet I don't see it being written by the first 100 people in the Boston telephone directory. I see it being written by some pretty hardcore elite people. In fact, probably actual aristocrats at their time.
Yeah.
And so I wonder if you could, what are your thoughts on the Constitution? Is it this brilliant de novo thing that we get in a historicist sense, right? Would Leo Strauss say, "Oh my gosh, you're being a relativist now by just saying this is a good thing," or is it an attempt to capture, a longer tradition of wisdom? If so, does that denigrate the importance of the Constitution if you admit that it's actually based on other ideas? So how do you unpack that vis-a-vis a right of center way of thinking in America?
That's such a great question. And I wish there were more a scholar on Strauss to know the answer to this. I don't know if he thought this or taught this, but I do know a lot of his followers. And of course, part of the reason Strauss is so famous is he taught people who themselves became famous. So your Harry Jaffas, if you will, and other Straussians went on to identify the American system of government in the Constitution, and maybe with Harry Jaffa, you say, and the Declaration too, as being the ideal regime we were looking for. That it is the perfect expression. Now, it's not perfect. It's just you don't improve upon all men are created equal. You don't come up with some other principle that's somehow better than that. And so you can certainly be a Straussian and recognize in the Constitution something that is enduring. And so I think necessarily then they would probably say, well, it's not completely innovative, right? It's not historicist. It has to be drawing on something, some eternal truth. I keep saying I'm 60% in agreement with Russell Kirk on a good many things. I think here I'm more like 40% in agreement with him. And by the way, I'm usually 100% in agreement with Russell Kirk. You just keep asking about the parts where I'm not. I'm more like 40. And I say that because, and he might have changed his tune later in life. I don't honestly remember. But in the conservative mind, he pays such very little attention to the American Constitution. He pays such very little attention to James Madison. He talks a lot about Hamilton, but not from his constitutional, Hamilton and Madison, John Jay are the big three Federalist writers of the Federalist Papers that in effect give us a lot of understanding of what the founders were up to and what they were trying to do with that document. He talks a lot about Hamilton, but more from his sort of commercial, his vision of how the United States could be essentially a power that rivals Europe, and the necessity of starting us on that path, and that we're not just destined to be some sort of a agricultural society that everybody has a farm and we just go along to get along, but that we have something to say to the world, if you will. That was more Hamiltonian's model. He almost doesn't, he mentions Madison so very, very little. And Madison, of course, is the father of the Constitution. Hamilton, too, important there, but Madison, very, very important with the Constitution. And I think, again, Kirk was probably doing what a good Burkean would do and say that the Constitution is a written document. I said earlier that Kirk would not list the 10 conservative principles in the same order, or maybe times he'd add to them or remove from them. He was very deliberate in these universal truths or things that we can't pull from the heavens right down. So what are we doing? We wrote these things from the heaven, we pulled it down, and it's different than the Declaration, you understand. The Declaration is it's not a political document, it's making a political statement, if you will. But our American system of government is not based on the Declaration. That's just the argument for why we broke with Great Britain and what we were doing, how we understand ourselves as a people. You can be aspirational if you want there, but the Constitution, that's how you actually run your country. It's dangerous to say this is hinting at some deeper truth here. I think that is a very understandable danger. But I think there is also an advantage to writing things down. Maybe thousands of years. I don't think the Constitution would ever be, say, outdated, if you will. But there may be ways in which the language as it's understood doesn't serve us as well as what it once did. We argue all the time about the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms. It doesn't really mention nuclear weapons in there because they didn't conceive of such a thing. So what do you do with it? You can get broader concepts of what were I think the Second Amendment isn't about the right to own a gun as much as it is the notion that an individual has a God-given right to defend themselves and their property. We just happened to live in an era back then where there was the musket, and so that was the natural weapon. And I think that is a universal principle, but how do you write it down? What if 1,000 years from now we have a completely different set of weapons and the right to bear arms is a completely meaningless statement because it doesn't actually work with the weapons we're currently using? It's dangerous to write these things down, but it does have an advantage, right? There's a real advantage to saying, no, these are those core principles. And I think one of the great aspects of the Constitution is it's so short and it's so simple, and it's not as lofty as a lot of European constitutions. A lot of nations have wonderful sounding constitutions and horrible governments, right? That don't live up to any of these aspirations. And so I think there is a need to be cautious while simultaneously saying, this is part of my history, and it is pointing to universal truths, even if it can't be fully captured in this language. And therefore it is part of the tradition I'm conserving. And I see it as part of the conservative canon in the same way I would the Declaration or the Magna Carta. It's not an aberration. It's actually something that's good and enduring. But it's, again, messy. I can understand why Kirk, Burke, to the best of my knowledge, he never said anything about the U.S. Constitution. I'm not aware if he did.
I don't know.
That was much later in his life, and he was probably
you
more
have
focused on the French.
and you have two constitutions, didn't you? You had the first one was 1776.
It was the original Articles of Confederation,
right,
which is
of
what
course.
governed the country.
Right.
Was far more contemporary with the Declaration of Independence, 1776, as you mentioned.
Right.
It's not until many years later, in the 1780s,
Right.
that we get the Constitution, and it's not till many years after that that it gets ratified. So it's sort of out there. That's part of the purpose of the Federalist Papers, is that Madison, Hamilton, and Jay are writing articles essentially arguing, here's why this is a thing we should ratify. There are a lot of people that were suspicious of it. One of the things they did to soften it a little, if you will, is, as you mentioned, the first 10 amendments are called the Bill of Rights. We have more amendments now, but the original first 10 were the Bill of Rights. And there again, it was something that Hamilton himself was kind of concerned about, is like, well, if you start writing these things down, that sort of implies that that's where they're coming from, as the written document, rather than a healthier model, which would be we recognize rights exist in sort of an English model, if you will, right? A common law, that it's not something we have to write down, it's just the traditions we respect. But in order to make it more salient for the people to essentially say, yes, we're good with this, they came up with this Bill of Rights, these first 10 rights. And I would argue that while that is dangerous, I think it has been a net positive, unarguably, for the United States. The fact that these, that from a court perspective, we can see, here's what's written, here's what we understood our founders were trying to do. We can modify that, but it's going to take some work. But short of that, we need to live up to this essential understanding of what rights are.
Yeah, brilliant. So as you're talking, I'm thinking, okay, this is something I've got to ask Yuval Levin. He's been on your show a few times, and this is one of the things I want to ask him. The tension, and you've been touching on this in your answer, the tension between written versus unwritten Constitution. I'm in awe of the American Constitution and all the process, although clearly I don't know it as well as I should, but the process that brought it into being, the amendments, the way it's, we can still look at it, dig into it, and the fact that there seems to be the assumption of a whole bunch of unwritten things. Like in Yuval's book, he says they don't define judges or lawyers or representatives. He lists a whole bunch of things that they don't define, but they're just assumed that everybody knows them. So right there, you have evidence of an unwritten set of assumptions. We could, dare I even say it, call it an unwritten Constitution. And so you almost have the best of both worlds with the British unwritten Constitution, but then you also have this line in the sand where you say, no, this is the way we're going to govern ourselves. And it seems to have worked really, really well. So I'm not sure if you have a comment on that. I was going to ask you one last question.
I will briefly say, and I wished I could remember the name of the individual, I cannot, that he essentially said the American Constitution is not for export. And I think that's what he's getting at, is without the unwritten Constitution, they said earlier, a lot of nations have beautiful constitutions, and it doesn't do them a lick of good. Yeah. You have to have the unwritten part first. You just have to. They're both important, but without the unwritten Constitution, as you're calling it, without a tradition that's cohesive and holds together, it does not matter how wonderful your Constitution is.
Yeah, brilliant. So I always, at this point in the show, I apologize for driving the conversation and just asking the questions that I care about. You're solving all my internal angst.
That's what I do on my show.
Okay, it's your fault. I got it from you. No.
Hey, to be fair, Sean, I was a lot meaner to you on my show. I was asking harder questions.
You were very mean.
I'm grateful you're a nice Canadian.
I was trying to think of a magnanimous response to that. I was like, no, doggone it. Josh, you tortured me, man. You tortured me. So, I thought you were a nice guy. Anyways, no, this last question I ask everybody. I want to know what keeps you awake at night. So what's on your mind right now? What are you worried about? Now, maybe you're the sort that just never worries about anything at all, but I think you are the sort that worries and thinks and creates podcasts that you stick with for, 7-8 years. So clearly you have things that bother you. What should we be asking right now? What should we be thinking about?
I'm going to maybe throw something out there and right or left field that's a little apart from the conversation we've been having. And I say this because I do think this touches at something deeply moral, even though it's also highly practical. And you could possibly extend this to Canada and most of the Western world too. I think what worries me at night is the degree to which we're living on borrowed time economically. The degree to which we are over indebted in almost all Western countries, possibly all, and our inability to reckon with that and to truly live within our means. I think that is ultimately a moral issue because we are essentially mortgaging the futures of every American and Canadian and Westerner, if you will. And I think it shows a deep inability to behave in a Burkean conservative fashion, which was always concerned with the people living, the people yet to be born, and the people who had died, respecting all three of those generations. And I know that sounds very, grubby, political, practical, if you will. And I don't claim to have an immediate answer. I just know that that's something that I see fundamentally both political parties in the United States and most around the world just don't seem able or willing to behave maturely and say this is an issue. And it is, I am hopeful it is something that creates havoc slowly and minimally and that we can kind of, eventually work back from it. I am fearful that it essentially means at some point future generations will necessarily never have opportunities we've had. And that there is some sort of a catastrophic chasm that, while in theory you could recover from eventually, is going to prevent the vibrancy, the innovation, the joy that has existed and living in these Western societies from being something that future generations can realize. And I say that with a full idea in mind that it's not all morals, not all about material things. Somebody I had a guest on the podcast. Chuck Marone, actually, president of Strong Towns. He made a statement that there was a measure, like some people were happier during the Great Depression. So I am certainly aware, that our value does not come from the material things, though we can have a spiritual awakening. But what I mean by it being moral is I think it is fundamentally an evil thing to deliberately not consider the good of the future generations and to behave in such a way that it necessarily is going to deplete their life savings, things that they have. I think that's a blight on our heart. I think that is a deep, profound, immoral way to deal with things, and I wish there was some party out there, some politician who, there are, few and far between though, who is actually speaking to this issue that is going to affect all of us.
Yeah. Yeah. No, that's fantastic. It made me think. You're going to think the only time I think is when you're talking, but you did spark a thought in my mind. In the middle of the 20th century, perhaps the most famous socialist in Canada, Tommy Douglas, and he's been accredited as the father of Medicare, right? Socialized medicine. That's a whole another couple-hour conversation that we're not going to have. But Tommy Douglas, very famous socialist. He was a member. He was the founder of the New Democrat Party. It had a different name before that. He's the grandfather of Kiefer Sutherland, so there's some connection there. He was in power in Saskatchewan, 17 years that he was premier. He had 17 balanced budgets, did not go into debt. Debt was just something you didn't do, even though he was very, very much left of center, very welcoming of the Soviet healthcare approach, very much about cooperatives and government control. They even had a government-run shoe factory at one point that went belly up, of course. So very strongly left of center and very much morally against debt. So he actually came up as a Baptist preacher on the prairies. And he had some nutty ideas too. He wrote his master's thesis on eugenics and so some really bad ideas.
What was it with eugenist and a socialist back in that era? They went hand in glove.
It was terrible. And I disagree with him on his healthcare idea. I mean, I disagree with Tommy Douglas. We'll just leave it at that.
Right.
But his 17 balanced budgets, I thought, wow. So this was across the board. People agreed that debt was a bad thing. And now to your point, across the board, it seems like there's an all-party consensus that no, we're all Keynesians now, and we need debt to, solve the failures in aggregate demand. And yeah, so that's a good shout out. Josh, thank you so much. I've admired your show from afar. I appreciate the opportunity to have been on with you a few weeks ago, or last week, I guess it was. And I'm really looking forward to seeing what you're going to do in the next 7 years of your podcast. So thanks again.
John, it's been a pleasure. I appreciate the questions.
Talk to you soon.